This video is brought to you by Ground News. For some people, grand coalitions represent the best of politics. Two opposing parties putting aside their rivalry and coming together to form a government, perhaps at a time of crisis, or to overcome political deadlock, and so on. To others, though, a grand coalition can embody exactly what's wrong with politics. Mainstream parties coming together in the pursuit of power, aiming to keep rising popular forces out of government. In any case, grand coalitions are, at least according to one study, becoming an increasingly common feature of European politics. So in this video, we're going to take a look at some current and recent examples of grand coalitions from across Europe, to explain why they form, who loses and who wins, and what they say about European politics at the moment. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. We ought to start with a rough definition of what a grand coalition actually is. It's an arrangement of government in a parliamentary system that involves the forming of a coalition between the two main, usually politically opposed parties. Think the centre-left SPD and the centre-right CDU in Germany as an example. So why do they form? Well, perhaps the most obvious reason is crisis. The UK, for example, formed a wartime unity government, which could be considered a form of grand coalition. During the Second World War, that brought the Conservatives and Labour parties together, and several smaller parties too. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Austria formed a grand coalition aiming to avoid the ideological factionalism that plagued pre-war Austria, enable the reconstruction of the country, and build democratic stability. This helped create what's arguably Europe's strongest grand coalition tradition, with Austria's Social Democratic Party, or SPO, and Conservative People's Party, or OVP, governing in grand coalitions from 1945 to 1966, 1987 to 2000, 2007 to 2017, and likely again following last September's election. A good recent example of a crisis-inspired grand coalition is the one that formed in 2012 in Greece, when the country was in the midst of its debt crisis, that brought together the centre-right New Democracy and centre-left PASOK. Generally speaking, though, in more recent history, grand coalitions have been formed largely out of necessity, with the goal of breaking political deadlock, rather than a result of an existential crisis. 3 of Angela Merkel's 4 cabinets were grand coalitions, formed after elections in 2005, 2013 and 2017, at which a grand coalition proved to be the only feasible or most desired option. In the wake of political deadlock following Italy's election in 2013, Enrico Letta formed a grand coalition featuring his centre-left Democratic Party and Silvio Berlusconi's centre-right People of Freedom Party. Ireland's election in 2020 delivered a notably split lower house, which resulted in a first-of-its-kind grand coalition between Ireland's 2 main rival parties, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. As a slightly different example, French President Emmanuel Macron's unsuccessful push for a broad so-called Republican coalition after this year's legislative election and post-election deadlock would have created a grand coalition of sorts, had he not been rebuffed by parties on both sides of the political spectrum. Now, in many of these examples, political deadlock is, at least in part, caused by a strong electoral showing by parties that the mainstream would like to keep out of government. In Ireland in 2020, it was the second-place finish of the left-wing populist Sinn Féin that prompted Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil to turn to each other, despite their historic rivalry and form a government. Similarly, Germany's recent grand coalitions have formed largely because the mainstream SPD and CDU had ruled out working with either the Left Party or far-right AfD. With Germany heading to the ballot box next year and the AfD currently polling in second place, another CDU-SPD grand coalition is a plausible outcome. Macron's previous bid to form a sort of grand coalition in France also represented an attempt at locking out parties deemed too extreme on the left and right. Jean-Luc Mélenchon's France Unbowed and Marine Le Pen's National Rally. So you can see why grand coalitions are generally considered to be something of a last resort for mainstream parties that are unable to govern alone or with their traditional allies, and in the face of rising anti-establishment forces would prefer to work with the devil they know. So how beneficial are grand coalitions for the parties that join them? Fortunately for us, there have been some studies on the subject, with one published in 2020 looking at 17 European grand coalitions formed since 2004. The study found that Grand Coalition members lost an average of 3.84% vote share at the subsequent election. This loss was more pronounced for the larger mainstream parties in a Grand Coalition, which lost on average 5.54% vote share. There are some pretty stark examples of Grand Coalition members going on to lose votes. The Greek PASOK lost more than 7.5 percentage points in 2015. The Dutch CDA lost 13 percentage points in 2010. The Dutch PVDA lost 19 percentage points in 2017. If we look at the current day, a similar situation might be playing out in Denmark, where the incumbent government is a Social Democrat-led Grand Coalition that includes their traditional rivals, the centre-right Liberal Party and the centrist moderates. Current polling shows the three governing parties well behind the results they scored at the 2022 election, while opposition parties on the left and right are enjoying growth. So, can we conclude that, from an electoral perspective, it's a bad idea for parties to form grand coalitions? Well, no, it's not that simple. In fact, the same study we discussed earlier shows that parties in regular, i.e. ideologically consistent coalitions, suffered a similar decline in vote share to those in grand coalitions, suggesting that, quote, perhaps grand coalitions are not uniquely detrimental to the electoral success of their members, and that perhaps we have oversubscribed the electoral cost to grand coalitions that belongs broadly on incumbents in general. On top of this, we have to consider that, in many instances of grand coalition forming, the alternative is either protracted political deadlock and repeated elections, or the breaking of a cordon sanitaire to work with parties deemed too extreme, which are both things that could result in equal or greater electoral backlash as forming a grand coalition. Ultimately, the real challenge for parties in grand coalitions is that it can open up political space for populist anti-establishment forces to grow. The AfD's growth at Germany's 2017 election followed Merkel's second Grand Coalition, and the success of Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy in 2022 followed Mario Draghi's Grand Coalition-esque national unity government, which Meloni remained outside of. Finally, with Denmark's Grand Coalition struggling, Ireland's Grand Coalition looking set to continue following last month's election, Austria's main parties in the midst of Grand Coalition talks, and a Grand Coalition looking like a plausible outcome of Germany's upcoming election, this story is far from over. Grand coalitions look set to remain a key part of the political landscape, and their performance could shape European politics in the years to come. That's certainly going to be worth paying attention to, and keeping up with the news is made easier by Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. They pull in stories from all over the world and organise them by story, and every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality and ownership of all the sources reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organisations. For instance, take this other major European story about the German Chancellor losing his vote of no confidence. Right away, you can see that the story had 575 outlets reporting on it. Of these, 39% lean left, while 34% lean right. You can also swipe through some of the headlines to see just how different some of the reporting can be based on these biases, with the left tending to focus on the historical significance of the event, while the right tends to focus on the economic and political implications, painting a negative view as the country heads towards elections. One of my favourite features of theirs is My News Bias. It's basically a fitness tracker, but for news. It tracks my reading habits over time, my trends in political bias, the specific news outlets I read the most, even the specific topics I gravitate towards. It's been really helpful in minimising my personal blind spots. Now, as an impartial news outlet, we're passionate about informing our viewers about bias and helping them to understand how it affects the media they consume. Ground News is very effective at this, showing you exactly how each side of the political divide covers each story you see online. And best of all, we're currently offering viewers 50% off their Vantage plan, which includes unlimited access to all of their amazing features like their blind spot feed. This is their biggest discount of the year, so go to ground.news/TLDR, click the QR code here on screen, or use the link in the description to subscribe today.